Welcome to another episode of Season 3 of the Panjwai podcast. As usual, you can find our episodes on YouTube, Facebook, and your favorite podcast platform, whether that's Spotify or Apple iTunes, iHeartRadio. You pick it, we're there.
If you want to support the podcast financially, we've set up a few ways for you to do so this season. You can become a patron by hopping over to patreon.com/thepanjwaipodcast and sign up for a small monthly donation. If you want to make a one-time donation, you can find us on Venmo at the Panjwai Podcast. And last but not least, we've got a small selection of merchandise in our store. So if you head over to thepanjwaipodcast.com and click on the store tab, you'll see stickers and other merchandise, and who knows what might come down the pipeline.
All that I can hope is you take me with you when you go. I guess I should have known I can't leave with you when you go. Now Cow Island is awfully quiet, with your screen door staying closed. And if I learned French like you told me, baby, I would hear your ghost.
Anyway, I came up to speak to the Corps cadets, and that's a phenomenal experience. You got to stay in the Buzz Aldrin room, though.
I don't know. That's what we're talking about. We don't know where we're going to stay, so we might have to see if old Colonel Rutherford can put us up on campus. That'd be pretty wild. Yeah, that hotel that they've got, that formal historical military hotel they got, it's obviously not the newest thing, which the Army's not known for, but it's pretty cool because I was always a fan of Buzz Aldrin and had met him in passing one time. And I got to stay that when I went up there to speak to Corps cadets, I got to speak to the students. And that was the room that they put me up in for the speaking engagement. And it was kind of funny because the interview that they did with Buzz Aldrin, somebody had made a comment one time about, he was known to be a heavy drinker. And, he even did a couple of interviews and he was like, I'm sauced. So what? I went to the fucking moon. And one of the interviewers asked him in the interview, like, why are you having such a, why do you think after 50 years that you're still having such a hard time assimilating? And he gave probably the answer that I think if we all thought about it, we would give. He said, once you've walked on the moon, what else is there? I mean,
hard to come back from that,
dude.
Go walk on Mars, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. You're that guy. I get, okay, so fuck you. You walked on the moon, I walked on Mars.
Right.
No, I mean, legitimately, we walked the earth as giants. We did stuff. I mean, you think about what we did. We did in less than 6 months what the Russians couldn't do with 10 divisions in 10 years.
Yeah.
And at every single turn, all of our sacrifices were upended because of politics. But there's not a single time that we can point to, I can't, our training or our valor or our integrity failing us for any, I mean, I can't think of any of it, in any of the services. And it made a very profound impact when I heard that comment, because I think if a lot of soldiers, another guy said, we were having some drinks at a different kind of therapy session.
Sure.
And the SF therapy session, it involved a one-legged hooker named Pete, a parrot, and a donkey, but that's neither here nor there. And but the guy said, you know what? He said, I'm working in this great job. I think he's working at, this guy was like No kidding. One legitimately, because I like to brag on my soldiers because they've earned it. But this guy was a warrant officer, and this guy probably he was on one of the DA teams and one of the commando teams. He probably killed more people than smallpox. And he said, you know what? I'll never be that close to other team members, or I'll never be that. I'll never have that much of a purpose in my life. It's just, it's just the three of us in a hide site, and then we're going to come out and ambush, or be the left flank security or whatever. And he said, when I didn't have that anymore, he said, I didn't know what to do with myself because I did that for 25 years of my life as a 40-year-old man, or excuse me, 48-year-old man. So I think if a lot of dudes heard that, man, that's important because it's okay. You're not going to ever, like the dudes playing in the Super Bowl, you're never going
to happen again.
Right.
Never going to do
it in that exact way, shape, or form.
Doesn't diminish who you are now.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely not.
Yeah,
it's funny you mentioned Buzz Aldrin. I think one of my favorite, and it wasn't really an interview, it was more of a recording, is when Buzz Aldrin was confronted by a flat earther. It was like outside something, and he punched the dude. He was like 85 years old, and he decked this like flat earth conspiracy theorist right in the face. It was so good.
That's awesome. Man. I'll have to find that clip.
It's not when he was young. It was because the whole flat earth thing is like resurged recently. Yeah. So like this was just some like young idiot, and he just like he just got knocked out by an 85-year-old man, dude.
You got knocked out by an 85-year-old astronaut. I wouldn't go back and tell anybody. I hope that
it's that, man. It doesn't matter. It's on the internet now. It's forever.
You have no legitimacy as a human being the rest of your life.
No, none. Except for the fact that unless you just phrase it as "I got knocked out by Buzz Aldrin," you can just kind of like leave out the flat Earth stuff, or leave out the fact that he was 85 when he punched you. I mean, if you got knocked out by Buzz Aldrin when he was 25, man, I'd be proud of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, even 85 is cool, That's a good story. If it wasn't for if you ran into Buzz Aldrin at a bar and you talk, and then he hit 85-year-old Buzz Aldrin decked your ass.
If you've never walked in a bar and said it smells like good intentions and bad judgment in here, you didn't really have a good time.
Right. Well, man. We're sitting here with honestly the inspiration for this entire project, if we're being completely honest. We're sitting here with Major Rusty Bradley, author of Lions of Kandahar, and commander of ODA 332, correct?
331. Yeah.
331. See, I get there eventually. I had two out of three. Right. And seizure of Sperwan Ghar. So
there's a lot of them. It's okay.
There's a lot of them. When we kind of started this project back in September of 2020, Luke and I were jokes like, man, wouldn't it be awesome if we could get Rusty Bradley to come on the show? And here we are, January 2022, and Rusty has graciously agreed to join us to tell his story and then offer some insights about the future of Panjwai and Kandahar. So, Rusty, we really appreciate you joining us.
For sure.
Thank you very much for having me.
Rusty, the way we kind of always kick these things off is we kind of give you a chance to dive into your background, why you joined the Army, why you chose the infantry, and then ultimately Special Forces. And then we wanted to kind of go through a few of your rotations previous to Medusa to kind of give an idea of what it was like for your previous deployments to Afghanistan, and then obviously, go from there. So give us a little bit about the history of Rusty Bradley.
My wife would say this is perfect because all I ever need to make me happy is a captive audience and somebody who has to listen to me. I was the first person in my family to go to college, so I got a scholarship playing college football, little university in the mountains of North Carolina called Mars Hill University.
Yeah, I know Mars Hill.
Anyway, it was just it was a interesting first couple of years right out of high school. Being brought up with very blue collar family in rural Appalachia. You didn't have everything, but you had a roof over your head and clothes, and my dad had always made me promise him that I would do at least 1 year of college because he knew me better than I knew myself. And if I went 1 year, then I would stick it out the whole time because I can't start something and not finish it. That's just how I'm made. And so I went to college, graduated, basically begged, borrowed, and stole everything I could, worked 2 jobs, played college football, and carried 16 hours a semester for 5 years. And because I was a true redshirt, and ended up playing my junior year and senior year. And I got out of college and I was like, what am I going to do with my life? At the time, I kind of looked into going to like federal law enforcement or something. But back then, it was the early 90s. It was much more strict. You had to do a bunch of, you had to serve so much time in local law enforcement or state law enforcement before you could even apply and all this other stuff. So I was literally probably 4 months out of college working double shifts at a beer warehouse because where I grew up in Asheville, it's mostly a tourist town. And, still trying to get my feet back up under me. And so I ended up running into an old buddy in a bar. Surprise. Hard to believe. I know. And he had gone in, we had been in high school JROTC together, and he had gone in to the Army right out of high school and was doing hometown recruiting. And he just said, I was woeing my blue over some beer, and he said, well, hey, come in, we got this like loaner payment stuff, join the Army. And I'm going to tell on myself because I'm one of those people, I'm all about self-deprecating humor because I don't really see myself as anybody who's really accomplished anything. I just did what everybody else did.
Right.
But anyway, I went into the recruiting office to see him. And of course, he showed me all the videos back then of guys jumping out of airplanes and blowing stuff up. And of course, he told me they had this loaner payment program, and it was right after Desert Storm. So drawing down the military, and they didn't want any, they weren't looking for officers. They were just looking for, normal enlisted soldiers. And, he said, I'll help you pick any location you want to go to in the world. And of course I was thinking, okay, well, Germany, South America. And he said, well, would you like to go to Hawaii? And I said, they got an Army base in Hawaii. I was just so naive to everything. Right. And he said, yeah, they got an Army base in Hawaii. And I said, well, what do if I'm paying back my student loan while I'm in the Army, like, what do I do for a job? Like, how do I make money? What do I do where do I live? And he goes, no. The Army gives you a salary. They clothe you. They provide you with everything. You're stationed in that state and you serve as a soldier. And I'm like, but they're going to pay off my loan too? And he said, yeah. I'm like, okay, wait. So you're going to let me jump out of airplanes, give me guns and tons of ammo. You're going to let me shoot at things, and then you're going to give me a paycheck? And all I got to do is stay out of trouble for 3 years? He's like, yeah. It's like,
6 months
later. And I took my dad was a Vietnam veteran, so I took my contract home to him, and he's like, well, you see, you're a grown man, you got to make your decision. So I joined the Army and went to cohort. I went into, as a program where as a college graduate, you went into basic training as a private first class. And then when you graduated AIT, you were a specialist and you went to your first duty station as a E4. And got to Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, and it was a combination of several things that I needed some regimen in my life. Of course, football had always been my, that type of academic regimen, work regimen, and I was used to hard work. So for the first time in my life, I was being paid for doing stuff that I really thought was fun, like rappelling and, running through the jungles and learning how to navigate. And I was probably the biggest point man in the 25th Infantry Division, but, I loved walking point, and I just loved being a soldier and learning about being a soldier. And one of the most important things my dad told me before I came in the Army was, he said, if you ever get the chance to be an officer, he said, the only good ones we ever saw were the ones who had been enlisted first. He said, you don't know what it means to be a soldier until you've been a soldier.
Absolutely.
And that really rang true for me throughout the tenure of my career. And then the first school, I'll never forget, the first school I ever went to was air assault school. And it was just like, it's just you competing against you.
Right.
You're either your greatest cheerleader or your greatest enemy. And you're going to determine where you go in life on how hard you push yourself. And I graduated that, and then like stuff just started coming faster and faster. I went to like Ranger school as a specialist, and
wow,
it was such a learning point and value for me, because you had to, like, nobody's going to give you nothing. Everybody's going to make you earn either a tab or your place in line, or there's a standard. And that's one of my greatest frustrations with the services now, is they're just willing to politically wrap the standards around whatever is the flavor of the day, whereas the fact that if you have a standard and everybody has to achieve it, then that's the benchmark for moving up or success or whatever it is. And that's the great equalizer. It doesn't matter what your race, color, religion is. You have to meet and exceed that standard to be successful.
So you would have gone to Ranger school. This would be mid-90s?
Yep. I was from Hawaii. They had like a murderous pre-Ranger program. So you had to go to a battalion RIP, a division RIP, and a division sustainment before you ever got to Ranger school. So you had been through like 10 weeks of training before you ever got to Ranger school. It's kind of funny, because when you learn the technique of overtraining, which is one thing I think the services usually do pretty well, is that you get to the point where, if you're used to having to do 65 and 75 push-ups and sit-ups, then when you go there and you have to do 52 and 62, and even though the Ranger instructor is like 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5,
right,
you get to 52 and you're like, okay, well, that's not that bad. I'm used to having to do about 100 to get to 65.
Right.
But those little lessons were the stuff that just kind of Velcroed themselves to me as I went along in life. And then, I got to do things that I would have never gotten to do. I got to go to Malaysian tracking school. I got to go to, sniper school. I got to go to foreign weapon schools. I got to go to, like I said, airborne school, air assault school. Funny story.
I ended up going E4 or an E5.
Yeah. Wow. I made E5 in 2 years. I think most of that was because of my college. But by the time I was in E5, I had my EIB, had been to Ranger school, sniper school, air assault school, airborne school, like Malaysian tracking school, like foreign weapons school.
It's quite the spread. What was the tracking?
Now you couldn't do that in 8 years as an enlisted guy. Oh my God.
I don't know. I mean, I truly don't know how it happened, other than it was just one of those, it was a peacetime army. And they have so many slots, and then the way that they divide those slots up is really almost on an OML list. So the way they did them back then was, the more successful you were at completing schools, because as a enlisted guy or even a junior NCO, when your team leader, squad leader, platoon sergeant sends you to a school and you graduate, then, it looks good on them as well. And that sort of internal training and feeding that desire. Yeah. And I had, to be very honest, I give a shout out to a good friend of mine named Jesse Markin. We've known each other for almost 30 years now. He was my very first, when I showed up to Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, that was back in the day when you lived in the barracks. There was like CQs. You had to sign in, sign out. You had to get permission to go on pass on the weekends. So many things have changed, and you had room inspections on Monday morning, sort of thing. Your squad leaders, platoon sergeants will come through and inspect your rooms. And, it wasn't like the Playboy Mansion where you just left your crap in your room,
Right.
I mean, they had standards if you were going to be allowed to use government facilities. And anyway, this guy was like, he was the anomaly from the Ranger Regiment. He had been, enlisted in the 75th Ranger Regiment, gotten out, been a police officer, and then come back in the Army. And he walked in and he was from Oklahoma, not an ounce of body fat on him, 35 years old, weapons squad leader, and he was in the middle of training for the best Ranger competition at 35.
Jesus.
So doing PT with him after playing football as an offensive lineman was hell.
Yeah.
Because back then, when they first came out with the TAF's condition standards and time hack, it was, we're going on a slow run at a moderate pace. Right face, and you're gone.
7-minute miles later.
Yeah, 7 minutes. Well, with him, I mean, it was like 6:20, and it was just brutal. But you see, you get in that environment where it's all tough love. Like, as long as you're pushing yourself, they're judging you based off your heart, your capabilities. I think God put all the right people in my life to prepare me for the challenging situations that I have faced.
So when did you start to think about going? Did you go OCS, or how did your transition officer go?
So, interesting thing happened. I wanted to get, like, the second or third time EIB came around, and I had already re-enlisted twice to get the bonus stuff for being a Ranger. So I was looking at like my 5th year, 6th year in the Army, and basically because I'd done everything else left on the island to do, there was nothing like I was going to get put on the EIB committee or get stuck on rear detachment detail. And I didn't feel like that was very fair. So I was very enamored with the Ranger Regiment and SF and with CAG. And I knew that one of those was going to be my next challenge in life. And I wanted to go, they have a scuba school in Pearl Harbor at Ford Island. It's a Navy dive and salvage school. But not knowing any better, I went to my first sergeant and said, "Hey, first sergeant, I want to try to go to this scuba school." And he never looked up from his desk. He's, super fit Hispanic guy. And he basically said, "Bradley, if you can get a slot, go." And not knowing anything about anything, I picked up the push button phone on the CQ desk and started calling numbers and ended up talking to this lady at this organization called NavSpec Warcom. and the gist of her conversation was, "Honey, I don't know if this is a joke, but if you can get a slot, and I'll get the U.S. Navy to pay for it." And I was like, "All right then, here we go." So I got permission, hopped my happy little ass in my pickup truck, and I drove down to Fort Island, and I drove straight to the scuba school. In uniform, had my starches on, walked in, just started walking around the school. I'm running into these instructors, and most of them are BUDS instructors or SEALs from first group right across the other side of the airway. And they're like, "Who is this moron?" And I said, "Hey, I'm looking for the NCOIC or the commander." And they're like, "Okay, well, that's what you want." I go in, knock on the door, and I don't understand any of the terminology. Pearl and Hickam Air Force Base is a pretty deadgum intimidating place, because Hickam is like perfect. It's like being at a golf course or a resort with, billions of dollars in fighter jets, and the Navy is just immaculate. And, but it's all new. You don't know anything about it. So I'm knocking on this door, and this guy screams, "Who is it?" And I said, I might have even been a Sergeant Bradley, permission to enter. And I go in, post myself, salute, and it was the master chief of the school, and his name was Master Diver Reese. I'll never forget him. He had to be about 5'6" tall, and he looked like something out of a Navy diver poster or a Navy SEAL poster. I mean, he was like as wide as he was tall. He benched like 400 pounds. He literally had been run over by a boat and had a boat prop propeller who had cut his forehead straight open. And this guy looked at you, and you only thought about not pissing your pants while you're standing there in front of him. And he was like, what do you do? You know, you are so... And I'm like, hey.
So out of line right now.
I said, this lady at this organization, he goes, a lot of expletives. And he said, all right, I'll fix this. He's standing outside. He makes some phone calls, and you can tell he's like, are you kidding me? Are you serious? Okay. You want to give him a shot? I'll give him a shot. Calls me back in the office. He said, you better find somebody to be ready because we start, and this was like maybe Thursday afternoon. He said, we start on Monday. And he said, you got to find a buddy to go through with you. And if you both don't graduate, neither one graduate. Like, okay.
Oh, shit.
8 weeks later, I don't know how, but somehow we ended up completing Navy Dive and Salvage School. And then we went on to do our Draeger training and get our, not only that, but our combat diver stuff. And I made E5, and it was just like the opening of a whole incredible, new world.
Yeah.
But I literally fumbled into a lot of success. Just, he who dares wins, man. Sometimes you just got asked.
Kidding. Sometimes the answer isn't no.
Yeah.
Well, Colin Powell said one time, I heard in a speech, I think he came to Fort Benning when I was going through OCS about my 7th or 8th year after I got permission to go to OCS from Hawaii. And he said that the Army is structured so somebody in life is always going to tell you no. It's your choice as to whether you accept that no. Now, of course, that's easy to say when you're a 4-star general. But.
Sure, right?
You don't get a lot of responses when you tell somebody no at that level, but it really kind of sank in. So I just ended up, to be very honest, if you think it's right, do the right thing. Don't be afraid. The two things that you learn are the accomplishment of the mission and welfare of the men, and they're in that order for a reason. But you got to be able to, take care of your men. And there's times that I asked for things or tried to do things and got crushed. And there's times that I was like, you're going to let me do that? Really? Okay. So you went to OCS at Benning? I did. Out of in 1997. Okay. I had gotten, my wife and I had met when I came home from Ranger School. I was on that's another crazy story. I was on the holdover status at Ranger School, and I knew a guy who I had been in Hawaii with that was working at 4th RTB at Fort Benning, and he put me on it was a holiday weekend, but he put me on a 4-day pass that linked it all, the long weekend. So I ended up with a 7-day pass to go home and see my family in Asheville. And anyway, met my wife by chance. And then a year later, we ended up getting married, and she came over to live for about 2 years. We were in Hawaii for 2 years, and funny story, we got deployed to Japan when I was at E5, and this was like my second time going to Japan. We'd been to Austria. I mean, we traveled all over the world doing cross training with other countries, and we were way up in Amori, Japan, like 90 miles from Russia, doing Arctic weather training. And we got this call, and it's freezing cold, blizzard snow. And we got this call, hey, they want to do a battalion formation. Well, the battalion sergeant major and battalion commander showed up, and I'm a squad leader at this point. And I'm bitching. I'm like, whose stupid effing idea was do this in the middle of the night in a damn snowstorm? The soldiers are going to get frostbite. Somebody's going to get lost, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? It was a promotion ceremony for me to E6. When you have that thought, you're probably not saying anything. It'd probably be good to follow that.
Yeah. That's funny.
But man, they still, I had some really good battalion commanders. As a matter of fact, Colonel Caslin, who just finished up as like the head of West Point, and I'm not sure which major command it was, but he was the battalion commander.
Oh, wow. Small world.
Yeah, very small world.
That's wild.
But
so you did the OCS
I put in a packet, and I'm sorry, I apologize.
Okay. No, I was just gonna say you did OCS and went down the officer track. So how long were you an officer before you started in SF?
Well, I guess the other question is, were you able to pick infantry and remain infantry out of OCS, or how did that work?
Yeah, that's funny because there's actually there's like a drug deal way that all those MOSs get moved around when you're an officer candidate. It's hard to believe, right?
Because you come in as infantry. I mean, obviously the expectation is that you leave as infantry, but that's not always the case.
No.
Right.
So what happened was around that time that I got promoted to E5, I started submitting packets to go to SFODD selection and to Green Beret selection. So my name was already in the circular for people that were interested to go.
Sure.
And we had one of those foreign deployments where my chain of command really put up an argument because I was supposed to be going to SF selection and didn't get to go. And this is pre-GWAT. So that's when, like I said, about 4 years when I was in was around the time that I wanted to either get in regiment or get in SF or try to get in at the unit. And it just timing never panned, and then I got married, timing never panned out. And I put in a packet to go to officer candidate school. I would come home every day just bitching about my platoon leader, my company commander. Now, of course, like all the stuff that they're learned to do at that infantry officer level 101, we were forced to learn to do as PFCs when even trying to be able to go to Ranger school. So giving, you learn to give op orders off the top of your head, warning orders, like you're ingrained and trained for all those basic functions. And I was coming home and complaining every day. And my wife's like, look, you got a college degree, do something about it or shut up. And I was like, makes a lot of sense. So I dropped a packet to go to OCS, and it just so happened that I got a set of orders, but it was to go to, I think it was 5th or 6th RTB down in Florida to run the scuba locker because they were so short of combat divers. And it was an actual E7's position. So me getting promoted into it as an E6, I wouldn't have been able to get rated until I was an E6P, but that's like a dream job, running the scuba locker down there for, recovery and all that sort of stuff. Well, then my orders 2 weeks after that, my orders came in for OCS.
Oh, okay.
So, we talked about it, we prayed about it, and then we just said, hey, this is the next big step for us as a family together. Well, my wife's 8.5 months pregnant when we get our orders and move from Schofield Barracks to Hawaii.
Right.
And then as soon as I get there, there's a problem with my orders, i.e. a problem as in they can't find them. So I'm afraid, hey, I'm a unassigned E5. I'm going to end up in 3rd ID. So I went straight over to the Ranger Regiment and called sniveling to all my cronies that I knew out at the RTB training facilities. And I was like, hey, can you guys work something in for me to get in over at the Ranger Regiment? And I had I ended up getting an interview with, at the time, Colonel Stan McChrystal and Sergeant Major Hall. And that was in 99. And so anyway, during the couple of days, that period of time that I was there, they said, hey, your orders came through. You're going to go to OCS, put in your ass packet and then come to us when you get done.
Sure.
And so that's what I did. I went to officer candidate school and then went and they let me blackbird over at the Ranger Regiment for whatever the 5 or 6 months that was while I was waiting to go to IOBC. And they sent me to the LURS leaders course, and I got, satisfied to be in reconnaissance platoons and, on LURS teams and stuff like that, which was all stuff that I'd already been doing,
sure.
When I was in the infantry and then scout platoon and the LURS company and then,
But now you're getting to do it over at Ranger Regiment.
Exactly.
Right.
And then when I went to IOBC and completed IOBC, I think that was around the time that when I went to report back, kind of the requirements had changed. And they said, look, you have to, in order to come straight back, you can't go straight into the regiment because you should have been assigned here as an NCO as a prerequisite for you to come directly in as an officer. And since you didn't, you're going to have to go to a conventional unit, serve 2 years before you can come back.
Right.
So I got assigned in December of 99. I got assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. And about 6 months later, I burned in on a parachute jump on Holland DZ. And it's just an accident that should have killed me. But by the grace of God, I fractured some vertebrae in my neck. And I think literally I had my spinal surgery and then was on almost like 5 months convalescent leave. But when I came off was all I remember, it was the first week of September in 2001. And I had just come off my refresher jump into the battalion headquarters. And they said, hey, LT, did you see some asshole crash an airplane accidentally into one of the Twin Towers? And I was like, that ain't.
That doesn't seem
right.
That ain't right. So, and then of course we all stood in the talk in the situation room. And when the second one hit, of course, everything else happened with the Pentagon and then Pennsylvania. And then we knew we were at war. So from that moment, we literally started like, it was game on. What do we need to get prepared? And of course, we had been through 8 years under Bill Clinton, cutting everything in the military to the absolute bone. So by the time our first deployment came around to Afghanistan in 2002, we went in to support the 101st right after Operation Anaconda, because it got a bunch of equipment and, guys shot up really bad and they didn't have near enough forces on the ground. And we were trying to expedite getting over there to reinforce them as quickly as possible. And I was at HHCXO at Bragg. And I mean, like by regulation, you're supposed to have 30 days of POL on hand. And the motor warrant that worked for me as a Brigade XO or the HHCXO, he was like, we don't have it. So I did what I thought, when in doubt, what would John Wayne do, right? So I took the Impact credit cards and I was like, hey, you go out and you buy every part for every, back then we didn't have anything but those John Deere Gators.
Oh yeah.
And all the Gators from Anaconda had been shot up. So I had them send me pictures and stuff from over in Kandahar of all the damaged equipment and everything else. And we literally went out and just blew the regulation out of the water and purchased several $100,000 on our $5,000 limit or whatever it was, credit cards. And the funny thing is that CID actually showed up in Kandahar on the deployment to investigate me for those purchases.
Well, there's the money there, and there it is. There.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I did. I was like, okay, let's go to the motor pool, and I'll show you where the money went.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It was just so completely asinine that they would. But that's just the reflections that you get from a peacetime army, where somebody war tourist, somebody wants to show up and make their name, doing one thing, and then they come rushing home, and it makes their career.
Mm-hmm. So your first stop in Afghanistan was Kandahar then in 2000, I guess that'd be 2002?
All 8 of my deployments were in Kandahar.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's nuts.
Wow.
Me and probably 4 or 5 other officers saw the war through the entire continuum from about 2000. Well, I know it went on longer than 2014, but the peaks and valleys that you can kind of say from 2002, when we had nothing, not nearly enough forces on the ground, to 2014, when you have that transition from soft control of the battle space to U.S. general purpose forces, and then ISAF forces, and then all the different ISAF commanders coming in and out. Right. And we saw it all. But my first deployment, if I remember correctly, is from early June or May or June of 2002 to February 2003. And while I was over in Afghanistan, and I saw, number one, I was a sociology major. So it's studying societies, languages, and cultures and sort of stuff. You grow up reading dime store novels because you don't have cable in your house. You get kind of that sense of adventure for what's the world like, and that's what I studied in college. So now I'm in another country after September 11th. I think we went in with the second wave of guys that were in there, something like that. And you see that this thing is not going to end anytime soon. And a lot of the guys that I had been prior service with, that we'd been in scout platoon together, or they'd gone on to the Ranger Regiment. Now these guys are all in the Rangers, or they're in Delta, or then they're in SF. And I'll never forget walking through the old airport, the original airport there on Kandahar Airfield, before they closed all that off, in uniform as an 82nd, high and tight paratrooper. And I hear this guy catcalling me, and it was Mikey Duskin. And he was like, well, he's looking at me like, what is wrong with you? Like, now you're an officer. I mean, you're following the rules. Like, what's going on with you? And
right.
Anyway, I just went over to visit him and talk to some of the teams that were there at the time. And I just made the decision while I was in Afghanistan that I wanted to be in group. And, here's all these guys that look like everybody's trying to portray today. Tattoos, ball caps on, beards, professionals. You don't have to tell them to do something once. If they don't know what they're doing, they're going to sink themselves into it to learn it better than anybody else could possibly learn it in a short period of time. Just true professionals. And I just realized that was the next, I felt like professionally, that was the next progression for me personally and professionally. And I made a few phone calls and said, hey, put in your packet while you're in Afghanistan. So I literally started training for selection in Afghanistan.
And I know I'm assuming it was the same way back then for officers. There's like a very narrow window that you can go to selection, right? You have to be a certain year group. And then at the time, remember, that was during George Bush and Don Rumsfeld. So what they did was they sent out a message to the entire U.S. Army and said, we are desperate for prior service, prior enlisted officers in SF, primarily from combat arms backgrounds. And you will not stop them from going to selection. So that wasn't greeted with
a very good reception. But
conventional commanders don't like losing their people to
no.
To the soft world.
We laugh about it today. I didn't laugh about it much. The battalion's operations officer, the brigade operations officer at the time told me, I hope you get selected because you don't have a job when you come back.
That's really looking out for you.
Hey, I mean, that was just more motivation for me to get selected. Yeah. And the thing was,
fuck you too. See you on the other side.
Exactly. Yeah, he ended up getting thrown out of the military in disgrace. So good on him. But no, I mean, all the stuff that they were asking you to do to show your basic proficiencies, like when you can learn to navigate in a jungle, like in Hawaii, in the gulches and the ravines, and like map and compass, basic fundamental soldier skills 101, like you have to master that stuff. And that was probably one of the only super great comments that any of my teammates ever gave me, because there was a couple of times when we got into some places way over on the Paki border that we got ambushed and sealed into the valleys, and I would just literally take those old Russian maps and the jog maps that we had, and I would compass and map and find the old Mujahideen roads that we knew were supposed to be in there from the Russian times, that, we were pushing supplies to the Mujahideen from Pakistan, across the mountains. And that's how we escaped those valleys on at least 2 occasions, was being trapped up in there and just mastering land navigation. Now, of course, some of it was riding on the side of a mountain with everybody in the truck sitting on the uphill side to keep the truck from flipping over, but we got out.
So when you went into selection, and then when was your, like, talk us through your selection process, and then when you got to your group, and then your next deployment as an SF officer?
Wow. You guys must know my life story, because every time you ask these questions, there's a crazy story to be had. So I came home, and like at the time, our manager even in the infantry was the Ranger branch, right? So you basically took whatever assignment they gave you, or you were going to end up in a year on a company tour in Korea. That's just kind of the way it went. And I called the SF guy because I'd submitted my packet and said, hey, he said, hey, look, man, you just got home from deployment. You want to stay home and make some babies? You want to take a little time? What do you want to do? And I said, nope, I've been training. I'm ready to go. I want to go. So 5 weeks after I redeployed home from Afghanistan, the first time I went to SF selection, and I made it through. And then again, talking to the branch manager, he said, hey, we got to, you got to get you, captain qualified and send you to the captain's career course. And, when do you want to do that? I said, put me in the next one. He said, I'm not too sure if you want to do that. He said, you're 6'1", 225 on a light day. And he said, because of how the Northern Alliance operated when the teams first went in, they didn't have a lot of armor training, so they didn't understand not only how to do armor operations, but armor logistics, supporting an insurgent force that has armor to be able to be used if you're going to support them and resupply them as a force multiplier. So they wanted Green Berets to start going to the armor career course. So that's where they sent me, Fort Knox, and bear greased my hip to slide my big old self down inside an M1 Abrams tank.
Oh, no.
That sounds terrible.
Miserable. And we were experts on being unwilling participants as infantrymen in an armor company.
Well, I mean, we're used to sleeping on the ground and looking for booby traps and everything else. And you get with these armor guys, and they're like, we don't get off the tank. Nobody.
That's before dismount.
That's before dismount.
I was like, what do you got to do when you go to the bathroom? They're like, MRE box off the back of the tank. I'm like, okay, all right. I see how you roll. But anyway, I finished that and spent a couple of months in Fort Knox. Unfortunately, I was again away from my wife, and I finished the captain's career course, and they said, okay, when do you want to start the Q course? I said, I want to get in this fight. So when can I get in? Well, same thing. It was like 3 weeks after I'd gotten back from captain's career course. I went straight into SWIC, into the Q course, and you had to do SUT, which was basically a small modified Ranger school, if you will, for 2 months. And then you had to do your officer qualification course, and you had to do SEER school, and you had to go to Robin Sage, and language school was the last part. And
did you get to go to Monterey for that, or was it at no? I
was one of 7 dudes that got selected to go through the first Pashto training, enlisted and officer. And at the time, Pashto, it's still a very rural tribal language with like 20 different dialects.
Yeah.
But they were like, that's what we want you to learn. And we had literally 7.5 months, no workbooks. We had like 3 different instructors from different parts of the country trying to teach us the alphabet, but there was no reading and writing. The oral speaking was so hard because you didn't know the dialect of the person that you were going to be talking to from Monterey. What you learn over time is that guy's speaking Dari. He's not speaking Pashto.
Right.
And you're like, how am I supposed to know this? So I did manage to get I have a little red pencil box, and, my house is a square box where I sleep. And I wasn't going to ever order any duck pate at the embassy, but, I could left flank, right flank, fire your weapons, look here,
Sure.
And it paid off. So I think I was literally like 2 or 3 weeks from graduating from language school and getting assigned to a team, or getting assigned to a group. And I wanted to go into third group really bad. And I knew guys from third group that were trying to help pull me in. And they said, look, because of our global area of responsibility, which has typically been Africa and the Caribbean, you probably need to speak French. So I went over to the language lab over at the Special Forces School over at SWIC and found an instructor who would give me a crash course in French. So I studied French for about 3 or 4 weeks, just enough to get a 0+ to get assigned into third group. And then one of the guys knew a battalion commander over there, and they sent a BNR, by name request for me. So I got a really interesting conversation from office invite from the commandant asking who I knew, because I just got BNR'd into 1st Battalion 3rd Group. And I told him the truth. Hey, I just know this guy from church. And he's like, all right, well, you're going. And the guy's name was Tim Slimp, and he's like 6'3" from Tennessee. Just, one of these, like if John Wayne had been reincarnated, that's what this guy would have been like. And everybody loved him. He was a no BS kind of guy. And everything he did was about, getting the job done and taking care of the soldiers. And so I get this call maybe a week before I graduated the Q course. We hadn't even gotten our berets yet. And I had it for a long time, and I don't know whatever happened to it. I had a little, like one of the first little mini Nokia phones that came out. And it goes off in class one day, and this guy says, hey, who is this? I said, hey, this is Captain Bradley. I'm over at SWIC. He goes, this is Master Sergeant Lubers. I'm the team sergeant for ODA 331. When can we talk? I said, Sergeant, I'm not even graduated yet. He said, I didn't ask you that. He said, when can you talk? I said, I can meet you for lunch tomorrow. He said, okay, meet me out at range 33. Bring your vehicle, bring some field fatigues. I'm like, okay. I show up. We get on a vehicle. They have some kid from the support company drive my truck back to base. We're back onto main base. And all the other team members are in the truck. And I'm like, well, where are we going? And they say, hey, you were in the 75th for a little while and, you did this and this and this. You pretty familiar with CQB and CQM, right? I said, yeah. Clear room, clear building. I said, okay, well, we're going to be we're supposed to be the CENTCOM Cree for this next mission. And we don't get the mission unless we get certified as a DA team in the shoot house, even though you haven't been to SODIC or Sephardic. So we're going to give you a crash course. We get out to the range and we're literally loading ammo and putting on body armor, and the battalion commander shows up and he looks at me. And of course, I still got my SWIC stuff on, just a field uniform. And he calls Team Sergeant over, has a few words, looks at him, kind of stern. He walks back. Sergeant Luber says, hey, the battalion commander said, make sure you don't mention this to anybody. But if you go through, if you manage to get certified, because you had to have an Assault 1 commander and Assault 2 commander, and then you had to have your your local support by fire, and you had to have deep support by fire, but you had to be able to show that you could do either the leadership in all three of those or all four of those positions, but you also had to be able to do C2, because you didn't know how the team was going to break up in a configuration if you're doing a raid, unilateral raid or whatever. So come to find out, I didn't even have my beret yet, and we were doing room clearing, getting certified for the team to get their validation, because I graduated 2 weeks later. I was assigned to my team and we were deployed. It happened that fast.
So another quick turnaround for you.
So that'd be what, 2004, 2005?
2005.
So Iraq was in full swing at that time too. So you guys were going over to Afghanistan when all the attention was being focused on Iraq. So what was that like for you, like to show up back in Kandahar again, second trip? And
the funny thing was we knew in 2002, like when they started cutting our ammo rations short because they were planning the invasion of Iraq and they were going to divert some of our resources in Afghanistan, we knew it was coming. We knew it was a true viability. And then by the time I got there in 2005, I think we, Task Force 31 went over there with 16 ODAs to cover the whole country. Wow. And literally that's all we had. We had, I think it was either 15 or 16 ODAs and one brigade from the 173rd over in Italy. Colonel Owens was battalion commander. And the thing is that we worked so well together that we had that's one of the things that Colonel Shinshaw talked about in the book. He said there was a period of time when like the Taliban said they couldn't take a piss and we wouldn't show up and hit them. And things were frustrating, but the dynamic was completely different. You could not drive through a village and didn't feel like a rock star. Like, people would hear about you coming word of mouth, and you would be driving up some dirt road or through the middle of town, and people would come out and wave. And they just treated you like a rock star. And it was a weird feeling to be that well received among them. I don't know how to explain it, but a lot of our resources were shortened. A lot of our capabilities were shortened, and that was part of the problem, if you will, was that we were left, instead of doing SF stuff, instead of doing UW and counterinsurgency and foreign internal defense and being a force multiplier and developing their army, which is what we started doing in 2005. We trained the 1st Battalion from 2nd Kandak, the 205th Corps, I think. And we didn't have a lot to work with, but what we had because everything we did, we mutually supported each other along the ODAs. And it was a Wild West, man. It was something. I mean,
did you guys operate out of fire bases? Were you in and out of Kandahar? What was kind of your operational situation on that tour in 2005?
Yeah, we were at probably the most famous fire base in all of Afghanistan. It had been Mullah Omar's compound. It was called Firebase Gecko. And we had some neighbors living with us that we worked very closely with. And
I know those guys. I've worked with those guys.
I think you probably had. And we just had we had a great working relationship with those guys. And it was funny because we had the only swimming pool in the whole country. The compound itself, about 300 meters to the northeast of it, was an underground series of bunker complexes. So it was a very fortified, properly built military compound and home for Mullah Omar, but it was built by Osama bin Laden for him. If people know anything about the history of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, they had some pretty significant political and religious disagreements. And in order to sway that favor, bin Laden had a very robust, nice miniature type palace built for Mullah Omar, and that was where we operated out of for 4 or 5 rotations.
Well, it's funny, they recently declassified information about the invasion of Afghanistan, and one of the things they declassified was that the longest air assault in history actually took place in the opening days of the war to Gecko/Mahalik, when Delta and 160th flew out all the way from Pakistan, flew all the way to that compound, hit it, and then they dropped flyers all over so that they knew that they could hit them there, and then they flew back. Because the Taliban didn't think they could get them there because it was so far away from where they were, and they did this crazy night mission, flew in. They didn't get anything because nobody was there, but it's just kind of plopping your dick on the desk and being like, look, we can get you anywhere. And then they just left. So it's kind of interesting. I think it was the
same night they hit Rhino and they took Canada. The 3rd Ranger Battalion seized Kandahar Airfield. But I'm pretty sure, that was Alpha Squadron that went in there. And because when we got there, there was still holes in the motor pool roof from where Spectre had, had plunked it up. And you think about how much effectiveness our enablers and our combat power had, because when you would go up to that bunker complex, which was built completely in granite, there were 4 entrances and exits at all cardinal directions, and they had put a J-dam right into the entrance of each one of those. And it was a pretty cool place to cut your teeth.
Yeah, for sure. Now, was it on this tour or on your previous tour that you first heard of this place called Panjwai? What was your formal introduction? I guess we probably should have covered that on your first deployment, but I didn't. I was so enthralled by the story, I didn't think about it.
Panjwai in the Sperwan Ghar area is one of the places that was like the boogie land. Right. That and the area between where Anaconda and Cobra were and Tarin Kowt, when you come down the old Tarin Kowt Road and cut through, not the Shugart Pass, but the big, anyway, I can't think of I'll think of the name of it in a minute. The big pass, mountain pass that divides northern Kandahar and southern Uruzgan.
Yes, and, I know what you're talking about.
You drive through there, and it was like driving along the Furlong Pass when we first got there. It was like abandoned Russian tanks and vehicles all over the place where they had just been, swacked by the Mooj. And we were constantly doing sweep, clear, hold missions. So a lot of what we were doing was constantly doing things that we knew that the enemy would not expect. So instead of, we started out going out for 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, 12-day reconnaissance missions where we would just move from village to village to village trying to sweep large areas and find pockets of resistance. And, we worked very closely with some of the other federal agencies and the FBI and stuff, trying to find, domestic threats. We had a couple of Gitmo guys, one that we captured and one that we killed, that were the catch and release that ended up back on the battlefield. But Sperwan Ghar was one of those places that, like, we knew the history of it. We knew that three of Mullah, Arghandab was where I think two of Mullah Omar's wives were from, and another one was from Sperwan Ghar, or one or the other. So he had a significant personal presence there, familial, and we had ridden through there a couple of times, and even in some of the really dangerous remote places we went into, that over on the Paki border and stuff, where you would drive into a village and you would have dozens of guys in black standing on top of all the compounds.
Right.
And you just are expecting contact at any moment, but they know who you are and they're not going to tangle with you. They know, because they call our trucks porcupines because of all the guns that were bristling off. I mean, every gun truck that you have in SF has the same or more firepower of an entire infantry platoon.
Right.
So, you got 2 or 3 240s, 2 or 3, saws, multiple grenade launchers, not to mention, RPGs, 60 millimeter, 81 millimeter mortars, Laws rockets, AT4s, Mark 19s, 50 cal. I mean, anything, and we even added stuff for the A&A. We made our own technicals, because in those early rotations, we didn't have gun trucks and we didn't have up armored vehicles. We did almost everything out of Hilux trucks.
Right. Mm-hmm. Which is awesome and terrifying at the same time.
It absolutely is. And we did a lot of the stuff that we did had to be in modified uniform. So you had to have, like, all the, everybody had to have something uniformed. Everybody had to have the same pants or the same boots or whatever, but you would wear civilian clothes. And you had to do it because you're in such close proximity to the civilians and the enemy that, typically when you made contact, it was either at 400 meters or more, or 20 meters or less.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But we were hearing that there was a lot of stuff that was going on intel wise in Sperwan Ghar, but at the time there were some of the other, because of our sweep clear hold mission, we were focusing on areas farther outside of Kandahar where the intelligence kind of pointed to groups of Taliban that were either, or Hig or Haqqani or Al-Qaeda, that were either trying to, make their way back in, or that were laying low there, trying to consolidate and reorganize sort of stuff. So we knew about it, but it wasn't what it ended up being a year from then, because the trigger for everything was after we did the in brief to Secretary Rumsfeld, and they turned the entire Afghan mission over to ISAF control.
Right.
That the mission then became stability operations, not maintaining security. And a lot of what the Canadians had trouble with was they were being expected to go out and do all these security and stability operations, rebuilding schools and roads and all this hand-holding stuff. And then they would be trying to do a med cap or, build a hospital or something, and they're getting ambushed and they're not being authorized to get in the fight the way that they want to fight.
Right.
So,
yeah, so it sounds like your mission kind of mirrored what the Canadians were doing prior to Medusa 2, which was, they were all over the place, but they never really had a home. It was, they'd be out for a couple weeks at a time, and, like you said, do some stability operations, maybe do a couple operations in one area, then they'd pack up their labs and they'd go to the next spot, or they'd go back to CAF, rearm, refuel, and rotate out with somebody else. The it kind of seems to me like in those days, the big fobs were home. You just didn't have the sprawling network of miniature fobs and refueling bases and cops and outposts and which is what the reality was for us in 2012. I mean, you couldn't piss without peeing on an Afghan checkpoint or a coalition cop in Panjwai.
Well, we were still running. I mean, we were still operating out of fire bases and like safe houses up until late September or probably early 2007. The integration of a lot more coalition forces and then conventional forces is what changed the dynamic.
Sure.
On the ground to start putting in more of those checkpoints and trying to establish a lot more security. But in those early years, there was nothing, and all we really had. The thing that bothered me it's like everything came full circle. So what I started to see in 2012 when we designed and implemented, me and Jim Gant went in as the very first two people to begin conducting village stability operations. So we were living in a district center in, Afghanistan most of the time, not even on a local fire base, like only being protected by our Afghan police or security forces, people that we had. But what we were doing was like alone and unafraid, sort of out there living in the districts with the people day to day. And that kind of immersion and alignment of forces was what worked in a place like Afghanistan. And what happens, we started that way and then we got away from it, and Big Army thought that they could do counterinsurgency, and all the services and everybody does some type of it. But, the important piece when I teach counterinsurgency today, it's like teaching somebody to play chess. You got offense and defense. You got kinetic and non-kinetic. Well, the non-kinetic is how you win.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But you got to balance that equally with kinetic operations as you degrade and attrit the enemy, and the support of the people. You got to strangle the enemy out of it. And so, for example, we would have one time, like one of our first missions in 2002 in Afghanistan, like one of my biggest challenges was trying to keep these guys resupplied because they were in safe houses in these super remote locations in Shkin and Lawara over on the Pakistani border, Kandahar, Spin Bulldog, and you've got a platoon of infantry from 82nd, 101st, 10th Mountain, but they're there and they belong to that SF team. So it's easier to do your mission when you have somebody, when you have actual, forces to help you pull security, because at that point, we had not been able to work with and train the Afghans. Most people's experiences with the Afghans are completely different than mine, because the Afghans that we worked with year after year after year, they adopted us into their tribes. We knew their families. We stayed in touch with them when we went home. That's why a lot of how we all feel about getting the interpreters and their families and stuff out of Afghanistan was so prolific, was the relationships that we built, because we saw the sacrifice that a lot of them were making for their own country,
right?
And nobody else wanted to recognize it. They just wanted to write them off,
right?
And
that's one thing that we talked about earlier, was the difference between your relationship with the Afghan National Army and ours. Yours were local to the south, at least. Ours were from the north. They were Uzbeks and Tajiks. They didn't really have any kind of connection. And you mentioned that was something that changed. And I guess we probably should save that to the second part of the episode. But that's, I think that was a critical part of the relationship you had in the first couple of deployments, at least.
It is critical, because when I talk about some of the individuals in the book. I don't know if they're alive or not. I don't want to use their names, but one of them was an Afghan soldier that had been badly wounded in an IED. he basically was left for dead. An 18 Delta treated him, managed to save his life. He ended up keeping both of his legs, even though he was pretty disabled. But he was the guy that I would buy the sneakers for that had like the white Pepsi t-shirt. And he commanded the respect of all of the other Afghan soldiers that we worked with. And I mean, if it took him 2 hours to get up a mountain, everybody waited for him to get up there.
Right.
But when we got there, it was on like Donkey Kong. But we did everything together. Because I ruffled some feathers, but we moved our A&A into parts of our camp where we lived with them, talked with them, briefed them, did operations with them. You have to learn to coexist and trust. And that's also, I think, in a lot of ways, how we always were able to prevent, because we had our shares of frictions with A&A just like everybody else did. But there was never they did a good job. Let's just say we empowered them to police themselves. So there was a couple of times when we caught dudes talking on cell phones or ICOM radios.
Right.
But they didn't usually last very long. If they came in with new recruits or whatever, they get sniffed out pretty quickly. And then they just disappear in the middle of the night. I don't know if they went AWOL or what, but they went away.
Definitely
Stuff like that happens on places like
it's a dangerous place.
Gecko. It's weird.
Yeah, strange.
Yeah, the Pashtuns have a saying: 2 men walk in the desert, and 1 man walks back.
Yeah, that's a good one. That one should be on t-shirt somewhere.
Yeah, we'll put that'll be on our next Panjwai podcast t-shirt.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned that dynamic with the living on the base and the relationship. And the only other time I've seen that was in Coast in 2017. Was the relationship between the CIA and the Coast Provincial Force. And that's just the way that they were so intertwined. Now, there's all kinds of criticism there as well. I'm sure it was, everything that it deserved. But, the KPF were an exceptional fighting force, far better than anything that I'd worked with in the country. And it was literally because they were there and they trained and they lived there. And it was a very symbiotic relationship with the Americans as opposed to what we had in 2012, which was kind of like dragging them out of bed to go on a mission. And not an exaggeration.
Yeah, our partners had the same thing. They had people that they worked with, and that was what I was kind of alluding to without mentioning the particular people. The agency. But we had pretty decent relationship with them, but the frictions would come in because a lot of them ended up being the first like special forces units because they had so much training,
Yes.
A lot of them had, we would run them through selection courses and like guys that would be able to navigate with a map and compass or read a GPS, or, you could teach them surveillance, counter surveillance, special weapons, actually engaging targets at night under nods, stuff like that. There was a little bit of friction with our A&A because we didn't have those capabilities for the A&A, and plus those guys got paid a lot more. So they had that sense of esprit de corps and elitism with us, but they, monetarily it caused a lot of friction. And of course we had to keep them separated on the camp because, it's like, our team against your team sort of thing. And we'd go out on an operation and come in, and if they'd be leaving the camp, who's got the biggest crank, who's going to, and
right.
I think probably that first year in 2005, I walked into more Mexican standoffs. I clearly must have been on drugs or something because nobody in their right mind would walk into, but it's just one of those things where cooler heads sometimes prevailed, and you just got to walk in and, if you can tell them that I'm shot, just calm down for a second. Why would I listen to me and talk it through? And then, hey, you guys put your vehicles over here, and then our guys will take our vehicles over here to the right, and then we'll all go take a bath and get a decent meal and decent night's sleep and live to see
So I guess that
another
would
day.
be kind of like the origins of the Afghan commandos then.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. And
I've got an Afghan commando shirt somewhere in one of my tough boxes that doesn't
that's
fit
cool.
anymore.
I don't even have one of those.
They were selling them at the bazaar in Panjwai when we were there in 2012.
Oh, really?
Knock off Afghan commando shirts in the bazaar. Yeah.
It's like, going to Virginia Beach and buying a SEAL t-shirt. I guess that's the equivalent
Oh, yeah. Well,
of that. or going to Fort Bragg and buying a SF t-shirt or something.
Yeah.
But I mean, hey, there's probably not, those aren't going to be made anymore in Afghanistan, that's for sure. So
no,
I guess
not anytime soon.
It's good memorabilia. So I mean, you do the 2005 deployment, which by all accounts, very dynamic, very active. Doesn't seem like you were bored very much. Definitely a big welcome to the SF community. How long between that one and moving on to Medusa or to the 2006 deployment?
Okay, so pretty much our rotation on the ribbon chart was 6 months in, 6 months out.
Okay, so you can pretty much reliably know you got 6 months off. And then...
Yep, and that is your pattern of life. And essentially, even the way that broke down is you always would do 2 to 3 weeks. You'd do a PDSS like 2 months out, and then you would go in. All the leadership would go in 2 weeks early, and then you would stay 2 weeks later to do your left seat, right seat ride with the ODAs that you traded out with. And then you came home and you did 45 days of refit and recovery and block leave, 2 weeks of block leave. And then you immediately started individual training, mission and area specific training, then your team training and all your collective training. And then you did your FTXs and all your validation certifications, and then you're heading right back in the box. So we did that on and off till 2012.
Jeez. And did you know that you would be going back to Kandahar, or did they rotate the teams around at all, or was there?
Yeah, a lot of teams. Some of the yes and no, depending upon who the battalion commander or the group commander was. A lot of us fought rigidly to allow ODAs to go back to those fire bases because there is an inherent knowledge base of the area, the people, the tribes, and it's so dynamic and it's so convoluted. If you don't understand it, I mean, you could take off on, units took off all the time. They would put, like that happened to one of the MSOT teams. I mean, the guys had never been in there, and they took over a new district. And when they did, they went right up the road that everybody knew was IED'd, but because they hadn't been there and there was no continuity between the other team that was new there as well, we were able to, in some cases, convince the commands that guys need to go back to those inherent habitual locations to maintain that continuity. And it's the stuff that I read and the things that I saw, we were extremely successful even when you had an attrition rate of about 30% on the ODAs, about every 2 or 3 rotations, you're still able to maintain that knowledge base when you go into a place versus, ending up, one of the biggest spikes in casualties we had was around 2000, I think 10 or 11, when 7th Group came in, took over all RC South missions, and 3rd Group got pushed up to RC East. Well, because we had always rotated in and out with 7th Group, and then when they started putting 1st Group and 10th Group in the mix from Iraq, then, guys weren't going back to their same regional specialties. And you had a pretty significant spike in a lot of things that were negative. And it's difficult because, we had built relationships. Like, one of the reasons that the ANA structure fell apart was because by the end of 2007, they were taking the ANA that had all, like, for the past 4.5 years had been working with only SF teams, and we made sure they got paid. They didn't get screwed over by their commanders or their tribal leaders or any of the Afghan generals, the ANA generals. We made sure that they were fed, they were properly equipped. I actually got in trouble one time because when the Ford Rangers first came out, I found out that the general was sitting on like 150 of them. And most of our Toyotas were rental trucks, and they were all beat up and run down. And I called 2 or 3 times asking for the vehicles, and they wouldn't give them up. So we did what any good SF team did. We were pissed, and we took about a platoon worth of ANA pipe hitters and loaded up, and we drove to the ANA base right outside of Kandahar Airfield. And I walked in the general's aide office, and I pulled up the box of 150 brand new sets of Ford Ranger keys, and we married up the first 10 trucks that we could find with the keys, and we put fuel in them and drove them up to the fire base. Needless to say, 2 days later, I got a visit, but I got my trucks.
Got your trucks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, possession's 9/10 of the law. You're Afghan, you should know that. Sorry.
Yeah. Come and take it. Come get them.
Exactly. Well, I think they thought they were good. I mean, I don't know. They're very good at. They're masters of interpersonal dynamics. They may not have a college degree, but they'll outsmart you at your own game.
Oh yeah.
And double agents, triple agents, people working for people. Sure. I mean, and somehow they managed to balance it at all because it's all so rudimentary over there.
Yeah, they've been doing it for 45 years. They're professionals,
4,500.
I mean, that's why they call it the graveyard of the empires.
4,500 years.
Because everybody that went in there didn't understand the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So when the 06 deployment comes down, you guys, you show up, you're back at Gecko, and you're stomping around. How long were you there before all the Medusa stuff started to get spun up? Well,
a good friend of mine named Chef Ford, I had traded out with him from my rotation in 05 to early 06. Mm-hmm. And then he was we shared a seat. He was in the detachment commander's position out of Gecko, and they had been getting all of the intel reflections and all of the holy crap, something really big is going on or going to happen in Kandahar. So they sent a group of our interpreters into the Pashmul Valley or in the Pashmul district because they knew that there was a high-level Taliban meeting. They had come up through the Rig Desert and were holding some big meeting there. Well, they tried to get the interpreters in there, and the interpreters got caught. I think somebody had a weapon or a GPS or something. They made it through. We know that they made it through one checkpoint. They made it through a second checkpoint, and then they went completely dark for a day and a half. And then one of our intel resources said that there's some mutilated bodies in Pashmul near the mosque, and that was our guys. So Chef's team and their ETTs and their ANA put together Operation Kaika, which is like revenge. Mm-hmm. And they went in there, and what they didn't know was that there was at least 300 insurgents that were in there to protect that meeting, and they had rings of security. So when they drove across the Arghandab River from I'm telling, in my mind I can see it, but they went from the south through the Panjwai Bazaar, cut past Sperwan Ghar, and drove up to where eventually the Canadians had the big battle at the White Schoolhouse.
Yes. Yeah.
That's where they went to the target compounds. I think they had like 3 or 4 target compounds that they went to, and they just got shot to pieces. Well, the ISAF forces, the Canadians were supposed to be QRF, and them deployed from Kandahar and made it to the south side of the river, and they would not QRF them. They could not get permission to QRF them. And they had already had 3 killed, at least 6 or 7 guys wounded, probably a half dozen A&A killed. They had been surrounded, ran out of ammo, and I'd have to let Chef tell you the exact story, but I just remember they managed to use one of the lieutenants that I talk about, Lieutenant Ali. He was actually I think he was a Hazara officer, and had been somebody that they picked on, but in this particular battle, he managed to rally about 10 or 12 of the Afghans with a couple of the SF guys, and they went and were able to push the insurgents back enough to recover the bodies, and then they got some CAS on station, and that allowed them to exfil. Well, of course, I deploy, and the first thing I do is I walk into the B hut where he is, and I could tell he was regretting having to do his in brief with me, and he was just overwhelmed with emotion. And he just said, "Don't go back in there without an army, man." He said, "I've been trying to tell Eikenberry at the time, I think was the U.S. ambassador, and I put it in the book. At one point, Eikenberry was sitting with Karzai in a briefing when the RC South commander, General Richardson, and Colonel Bulldog and them went up to brief him and said, "Hey, we know for a fact that there's hundreds of fighters coming across the border to push into Panjwai, and we need to do a large-scale operation." And at the time, somebody threw out like 12 or 1,500 insurgents in this valley, and Eikenberry said, "Well, there's not that many Taliban in the whole country," and he tried to write it off. And eventually, one of the Afghan generals convinced Karzai that, we need to do this operation if for nothing else to confirm or deny, but we need to go in with a big enough presence that if we do run into anything, we can deal with it and make it done. And that's how pretty much Operation Medusa was started, was off the back of Chef's mission, where those guys got chewed up. And the Canadians were going to go in and sweep the whole northern portion of the Panjwai Valley, I guess, with armored vehicles. And they drove right into, well, I'll get into all that later. But.
Yeah. I mean, that's what kind of fascinating about the plan for Medusa is it never really involved the Horn of Panjwai. It always involved everything north of the Horn in what's now Zari. They were so worried about, I guess, because, Highway 1 is up there, which makes sense. But, it's like they were surprised at the fighting that you guys experienced eventually at Sperwan Ghar, because they were never even planned to go in there.
No, absolutely not. And that was like, if this thing ever plays out to be a movie, I mean, it's crazy, because when we did our infiltration up from the Rig Desert, we drove all the way down to Pakibet and then, drove up through the Rig Desert. And the first place we came to, I mean, that was a doggone safari adventure right there.
Yeah.
Crossing the Mojave Desert in 5 days without the right vehicles. And we came out, and there was a little enclave in this village that looked like a Taliban talk. I mean, there was literally antennas sticking out of the top of this building. I don't know, 6 or 8, FM antenna, like, cell phone antenna, like a myriad, like that ain't a bazaar. So we decided to go pay them a visit, and they saw us coming from a distance. Probably 30 or 4 of them jumped on motorbikes and took off. But that was where Riley found the notebook, and it had the names of about, I don't remember the math, but it had the names and phone numbers and the numbers of fighters. So it had Taliban subcommanders and the number of fighters. Well, when we sent that up, they were kind of like, we don't know if we really believe this. Now, I don't know what you need to see to prove it. But when we started looking at the battlefield, how would we do this? How would we set it up if we were fighting the Russians or, whatever? And draw them into a fight, either on the north or south side. But you got to have, all the, Clausewitz doesn't leave any operation. You got to have, you got offense, you got defense, you got to be able to move, shoot, and communicate. So they got to have a C2 somewhere. We knew that they had some foreign fighters in there. We knew that for a fact. We had heard some high-sided, had Arabic voices, Chechnyan voices, Sudanese, Yemeni radio intercepts, cell phone intercepts. So we knew that this was Pakistani ISI.
Shocker, right?
Yeah, shocker. And they were the ones coordinate this, and that's why it kept evolving to be something bigger than, a bunch of groups of people just trying to ambush you and
right.
Spray and pray. So then we looked at, where would you put a reserve force? Where would you put the C2? Well, if I was going to C2 this, I'd put a C2 down in the Horn. Well, guess what? Mushan ended up being the C2, and Sperwan Ghar ended up being like the high ground and observation, but that was where they had the reserve force. So they were waiting for the Canadians task force to cross the river, and then as they progressed from east to west on the north side of the river, the reserve force was going to come in and hit them from the flank or from the rear.
Yeah.
Right.
And
it just seems so naive of the Canadians to not even think of that. Like that entire
a lot of it wasn't the Canadians.
Dense.
I mean, like even General Richardson, who was the ISAF commander, and I'm trying to think of the name of the RC South commander. He was, I think he was Dutch, but somebody from higher echelon ISAF and the embassy was the one that was putting the brakes on them, because the night before the Canadians were supposed to go in, my friend Andy, who was the recce company commander for the battle group, the recce company was prepared to move in 4 or 5 elements, move forward, get eyes on the enemy targets, mark them for artillery and CAS, and they were never allowed to do that. General Richardson or whomever the RC South commander was ordered to press the attack. And Andy and I talked about that number of times. And even the task force commander, I to this day, I know he told us he was ordered to do it. And nobody does. I mean, you always do a reconnaissance. Right. Even if it's a map reconnaissance, satellite reconnaissance, you always do a reconnaissance. But they had the ability to move forward and get eyes on with their capabilities, whether it was scouts, LURS team, soft guys, whatever. And they were told, hey, you're going in the morning.
This idea to travel across the Reg and set up that blocking position just south of the Horn, how did that kind of come about? I know in the book, there was, I figured it was you. It was a rhetorical question, Rusty. Gosh.
Thank you. Thank you for feeding me that one. That was good.
But, obviously, I know in the book there was some talk about we want to get SF involved in this mission. We think the Canadians are in a little bit over the head. We need to be postured there to help, or at least, be able to watch the carnage, I guess. I don't know. But, it makes complete sense to put a blocking position right on the edge of the Registan Desert. But why did you want to drive across it?
Well, the thing was that was the most, essentially, to be able to use cover and concealment. Remember, I talked about trying to travel from Kandahar Airfield not long after we got there to Firebase Gecko, when Sheffield's Ford's guys were escorting us, and we ran across several groups of Taliban personnel in the street that had not been linked up with their commanders or with weapons.
Right.
But it was so clearly obvious who they were. So we already had those inklings that this was not normal. Like there was something else going on. And another thing we didn't talk about at the time was that high side intelligence had captured the cell phone call from Mullah Dadullah Lang promising to Mullah Omar that he would have Kandahar taken by Christmas or New Year.
Right.
So we knew that there was immense pressure we just weren't seeing we were getting all the intelligence of it happening. All these literally groups of insurgents walking around the villages with their weapons and everything else, these large meetings going on between Taliban commanders and sub-commanders. And ultimately, we believed that because we knew the Rig Desert was a way that they would infiltrate and exfiltrate or to do resupply because it wasn't heavily patrolled. Mm-hmm. It was a gap in our capability.
You need an army to control it.
Yeah.
It's so massive.
Well, I mean, and there's a couple of places like that little mountain range that we ran into. You can see it on the map, but that's down there in the Rig Desert. And what the insurgents would do is they would come across a border and they would get linked up with their heavy weapons and stuff, because we found those rock faces where they had dozens, over 100 impacts from RPGs and recoilless rifles and everything else that they would either test fire the weapons or they would, do weapon instruction down there in that little mountain range. But it was just literally jagged rocks sticking up, and you had to get climbing equipment to get up there. So if we were going to be, they wanted initially the participation to be extremely limited and focus on killing or capturing the insurgent leadership that tried to leak out of the valley.
Right.
Now, we all knew that if they went anywhere, they would go to the Helmand.
Right.
They wouldn't go through the Rig. So when I talked with Bruce Scullion and Dave Hodges, we're like, well, what's the best way to come in the back door on these guys and close the south? And then that leaves all of Highway 1 for the coalition or the task force to be able to secure and prevent these guys from getting over into Bandy Timor and over into Helmand. And that was why I came up with, well, let's take 2 ODAs and we'll skirt the border and we'll actually jump on one of the Taliban insurgent routes because they don't mind their own roads coming across the border.
Right.
And that's how we figured we would get up through the desert, and then we would be postured in all the blocking positions. So when the Canadians initiated their assault, we would be in position to either A, kill or capture as our primary mission, or B, to support the Canadian task force if they needed it.
So was helicopters ever discussed or considered, or was it just too high profile, high visibility?
That's funny because I don't really remember. I think we always had an issue with rotary wing lift, rotary wing resupport, and rotary wing QRF. Rotary wing is the only and primary way besides horseback or on a foot with donkey to get mobility in that country. I don't honestly think that there was enough aircraft in the theater to support this type of a large scale operation. We already knew there wasn't enough when they did Anaconda. So they never had enough. And you got to remember that at this time, there's also a lot of other kinetic supporting operations that are going on. So it made more sense for us and gave us the future mobility. If we took the vehicles and the ATVs to cut through the Rig Desert with little or no detection and then occupy our blocking positions on the morning that they assaulted, because of the distance between where the mountain range was, where our blocking positions were, and where the Canadians were assaulting was probably another 10 or 15 kilometers of village complexes. It's just a labyrinth.
Well, and I'm glad that you guys chose to do this because you get this wonderful story of, 20 vehicles trying to cross the Sahara, I feel like it's like straight out of an Indiana Jones movie.
When the movie is made and the open scene, it's just gun trucks bouncing across the sand dunes.
Oh yeah, and you had, it's funny because I don't think about this stuff until I have a conversation with somebody, but we had every imaginable. We had to stop at one point and teach the ANA how to drive those trucks in the sand. Like we had to stop a combat operation and put on a driving class. Not a joke.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
But it worked. And then after we did that, I mean, you had like one of the, you know, you would always tell the A&A, they'd put their hands over their AK and put their head over their gun. I'm like, please make them take their head and their hands off, because, you know, it's an open bolt weapon system. So as soon as that truck bounces, sure enough, I think we were 2 days into it, one of the A&A blew a hole, like spade his hand wide open, riding an AK in the back of the truck. But I mean, oh my God, the point where we stopped the camels with the guy who was the son-in-law or whatever, or the future son-in-law, taking all the camels to pay for his future wife's dowry or whatever. I mean, I've got a picture of the A&A setting up shelters, and they were taking RPG rounds and sticking the heads into the sand and then tying a poncho to it. I can't make this up. I mean, I'm a creative dude, but.
Oh, man. So you guys are adventuring across the ridge, and then you get into your blocking position. So day one, shit starts going down with the Canadians.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 3 of the Panjwai Podcast. We appreciate you sticking with us all the way to the end of the episode. But just one more thing before you go, please hit the like and subscribe button, and make sure that you are following us on our social media.